Howdy everyone, and welcome to another Lupen TV video. Today I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about the newest class that's available, the Dractyr Evoker. This class has two specializations, the first one being the Devastation spec, that is your traditional range DPS class caster, and then the second is Preservation, which is the healing spec. Now, worth mentioning, most of my time was in the pre-patch with a little bit of beta testing when they were still kind of tuning most of it. And they are obviously, just like all the other classes and specs, missing 5 talent points for both the spec and for the class itself. And I really do feel that this is very important for Evoker, probably even more so than other classes that have been around for years and kind of have developed their identity. So obviously things could change once we get level 70, but things I'm going to talk about in this video are mostly just my initial thoughts and understanding kind of like where are they at currently, at least in my mind. Now, before we talk about the individual specs, I really want to spend more time talking about the range on their abilities, and that's been a huge point of contention with the community on, asking for further range or just different changes to it. And Blizzard has made their stance fairly clear, which I'll talk about in a second. The issue really being that the Devastation spec and those abilities have a 25-yard range, whereas the Preservation has a 30-yard range on most of their abilities. So that right there, at least in my testing, never really felt like too much of a burden. Granted, most of my time was in dungeons where, we were already in tight hallways or tight spaces, so we really were able to, kind of like manipulate, I guess, when and where you're attacking. Open world, I felt a little worse, and that's mostly because I'm used to playing 40-yard range classes. So I was spamming like my Azure Strike, when I was still 10 to 15 yards away from where I needed to be. So that kind of felt a little bit bad, but I mean, as far as raid goes, I think that's where it's honestly going to feel the worst, when you're kind of stuck between the melee and range groups. And in situations where you need to be closer, it'll feel good. And in situations where you need to pull away, it will feel bad. And then obviously with PvP, that is completely subjective based on like where you're at, what are you doing. So for instance, I could see them maybe not feeling as good in battlegrounds, but in arenas where you're already, on top of each other, I'm sure they'll be fine. And Blizzard's real way to compensate for this, and I would actually agree with this too, is using spells like Verdant Embrace, which allows you to dash towards your target, or even spells like Hover, which allow you to position quickly, even cast too while moving. So I do think that Blizzard has given the tools, and I hope that this continues to work out, because I really like this idea of a mid-range class. I just think that it can feel bad in those specific scenarios depending on what you will be playing the class for. So with all that being said, let's kind of jump into the first spec, which is Devastation. Conjuring blue and red magic to devastate your foes has really never felt so good. The main point of this role is just, breathing fire, blue magic, all of that stuff you think about when you think dragons. And now, what are my overall thoughts on the spec? I mean, easily the class fantasy and the spell effects are just top tier. They're very modern, similar to how maybe a Demo Lock felt a couple expansions ago. And you can clearly tell, just like with Demo Lock, that Blizzard has spent a great deal of time on focusing on the feeling of what the class you're playing is. And in this case, obviously breathing fire and being a dragon. Now, the spells do feel very quick and snappy and very impactful. One of the new features they did add, was the hold to cast for spells like Fire Breath and Eternity Surge. And they do vary, so you don't always necessarily have to hold it down for its entire duration. For instance, Eternity Surge, the longer you hold it down, the more enemies you hit. So if you're hitting fewer enemies, you don't need to hold it down, which in my opinion feels good, because then you're kind of nuancing the playstyle a bit given the circumstance that you're in currently. The damage profile is very bursty. It does have some sustained, however, the amount of damage, at least I was able to unleash with all of my CDs up, was kind of nutty. This makes me think that there'll be a monster in at least PvP, probably more arena if I had to guess, where if you can catch your opponent off guard, you could easily probably KO them, no problem. And I think Zaru has actually demonstrated this quite a bit on his most recent videos of just these crazy setups into this stacking buff, boom, and just literally KOing someone. There are definitely some areas of mastery, with that being said, with different spells, but there's not as many compared to other classes. And for me, I always end up, looking at Balanced Druid or like even a Mage too, to compare against. And they definitely have a more limited amount of active abilities that they are pressing as part of their rotation. Personally, there are other range classes that grab my attention a bit more from a sophistication standpoint. But as I said before, the spells look incredible and it feels very satisfying to play. So let's talk a little bit about Preservation. I definitely have, want to at least start with healing is not the same as damage dealing. Whereas damage dealing, you're generally following a set rotation. With healing, you generally have a same reaction in some scenarios with which spells you're casting, but there's far less of that, kind of repetitiveness that you would get maybe in a damage profile. So, healing itself is meant to be reactive and kind of personalized to your playstyle. And for the main abilities, you've got things like Echo, which is one of your main spenders and allows you to duplicate any spell you cast to those affected by your Echo. Rewind reverses the damage taken by your party for the last 5 seconds, similar to how Frenzied Regen would work for a Guardian Druid. A gray oh shit button, which is I think good for like people first coming into the class or even into healing in general to have that. And then their single target CD, which is time dilation, and it kind of draws on the Monk's stagger ability, helping smooth out damage that maybe your tank or an ally have done. You can still cast, your deep breath and all of that, just like you would as a devastation evoker. And then really you've got like Spirit Bloom for this big group healing. So the spec does feel like it has the entire toolkit attached to it. I really think that by giving them this 30-yard range, they kind of were like, okay, we gave them the 30-yard range, so we're going to give them the entire rest of the kit as a kind of way to make up for it. So they have a lot of straightforward damage, like I said too, which makes it good for anyone that maybe is like not used to playing a healer and then also doing damage, because once you master healing, you really should be helping your team do damage as that next step. And I think Preservation does a great job of that. I plan to see how much I can play test this a bit before Dragonflight, but for the few dungeons I did test, it is crazy amount of depth that you have at least available to you, and it definitely has my interest, at least for healing for Dragonflight, as I consider what classes maybe I'm leveling first, and then maybe what specs I'm maybe like prioritizing. So why would you play Evoker really in Dragonflight? I definitely feel like the obvious answer is class fantasy here. We were about going into a dragon themed expansion, and based on at least historical evidence, Blizzard rarely lets a new class be subpar. They're clearly dedicated a ton of time to the class, and you can feel it when you play it. So everything just works, I'll say, just based on how they have it currently set up. Now, that could change. I kind of doubt there'll be any major changes between now and the expansion, or even first raid tier, or Mythic Plus, or PvP season. But I'd also recommend playing it if you think the range thing would not be an issue. Blizzard has been forthright that they really want to stick with this mid-range class, and I'm actually in support of it too after playtesting it a bit more, just based off of the toolkit. If you didn't have things like hover, I'd probably feel completely different, but it's up very frequently, and so you never really feel like it's too big of an issue that you can't play around either. And I'd like to maybe kind of call a little bit of an honorable mention to their party raid buff, which is the Blessing of the Bronze. It's been very difficult to gauge even from a power level for our guild on understanding how beneficial it is to really the group. It's not like it's a flat 10% intellect buff like Arcane Intellect is, so the value is like very situational. Those times where you need to blink a bit sooner or charge to close that gap a little bit on an enemy, it'll feel great, but I don't know that you're going to be necessarily saying, glad we have a Evoker, either, because those are so reactionary and split-second decisions that you're more or less just like running through these dialogues in your brain on what you should be pressing, and oh, it's available, great, press it. So kind of hard to judge right now. I mean, I definitely think it has some value, don't get me wrong, and with how much people prioritize movement speed, just with sockets and, just group buffs and things like that, I do think it will have more value than probably people are giving it credit for. All in all, though, I'd say I'm extremely thrilled with the class. I doubt I will main it in Dragonflight, really, unless our guild really needs that buff. We have no other raiders expressing serious interest. But I do plan to level it maybe as like a second or third, depending on just, once again, what are the guild needs. Preservation for sure has my attention, but I was able to kind of master Devastation, or at least get the core basics pretty quickly. So that's always going to be at the ready too. But yeah, I hope you all enjoy watching this video. I really wanted to just get my initial thoughts out there as we are about a week on the day from when I'm recording this. So I will be streaming Monday night when it launches, so definitely stop by to get your Feldrake mount. And then, stay tuned for more videos. As, release happens, I'll probably do a couple more with just the hype of release. And with that being said, thanks everyone. We'll see you on the next one.